They would call it an incredible act of courage. A single dad throwing himself between a frightened child and a sudden, deadly threat. It happened in a room that glittered with wealth. Crystal chandeliers, cameras, and people who dressed like the world owed them everything. It would change the lives of everyone who watched. The ballroom at Lane Corporation was a web of light and sound. Waiters slid between tables like practiced shadows. Reporters smiled into cameras. A pianist filled the air with something elegant. On the raised stage, Isabella Lane adjusted a microphone with hands that never stopped planning. Sophie, her daughter, stood at her side in a pale dress that caught the light. She looked small and serious, as if she were already learning how to be careful. Michael Hale was not supposed to be part of the audience. He had clocked in earlier that night, keys and toolbox tucked under his arm, the familiar weight of maintenance routines on his shoulders. He wore a work vest with a name patch that read Hale. He had spent the afternoon fixing a stuck elevator, and later swapped the fluorescent hum of a service corridor for the warm buzz of the gala, because sometimes maintenance meant making sure a world kept moving without being seen. He moved through the crowd the way invisible men move, attentive, unobtrusive. He paused near the stage to adjust a loose panel of wiring. He watched Sophie watch her mother. He watched the way Isabella's smile did not quite reach her eyes. He heard laughter that slid like gold across the floor, and a few snorts of derision from a cluster of men nearby who thought they were making a private joke. He folded away the sound and kept working. Then a gunman's hand rose. Time narrowed. There was the metallic whisper of leather on metal. Cameras stuttered. For a heartbeat, the world dissolved into single sounds. A slippered foot against polished tile. The tiny intake of a child's breath. The hard thread of a jacket. Someone screamed. Glass trembled. The piano faltered. Michael saw the flash against the gun's muzzle. He saw Sophie, frozen, her face the color of candle wax. The man in front of him was at a distance that made the seconds feel like inches. Everything he had been trained to do, everything he had once practiced in a life that had nothing to do with gala tickets and champagne flutes, returned in a single, narrow corridor of instinct. He ran. He closed the distance in 3 long steps that felt longer than they were. He threw himself between the gun and the girl. The shot cracked. It sounded like a window breaking. He landed on his ribs. He felt the weight of his body fold around the child. He heard a softer sound, the small rustle of Sophie's dress. He felt the heat and then the coolness of blood, as reality moved in a clinical, terrifying sweep. He dipped his voice, no more than a breath, and let the words find no audience but the small child beneath him. "You're safe now," he said. Security moved. Guests screamed. Someone grabbed the shooter. Someone else hit a phone record button. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of people learning they had been part of the wrong story all along. Paramedics came like a second wave. Hands searched for a pulse, for a place to stem bleeding, for a route out of the crush. Michael's daughter, Ella, a little flame of a girl who had been with him that night because he refused to leave her behind, held onto his hand as they carried him. She ran with the ambulance, almost as if the pace of the vehicle could outrun her panic. A hush settled over the ballroom later, when the lights dimmed and the microphones went quiet, when the cameras caught the pale outline of a father on a stretcher and the CEO standing at the edge of her empire, undone. If you believe real heroes walk among us, subscribe to see more stories like this. The ambulance was a compressed world of clinical noise. The siren thinned to a single keening note. Michael lay with his eyes half closed and watched fluorescence move over the ceiling like a false sky. The paramedic's voice was calm and detached, the tone of someone who had practiced order in chaos. "Gunshot to the upper chest," he said. "Heavy bleeding. Keep pressure on the wound. Airway stable for now." Ella sat on the gurney beside him and would not be moved. She had a small face and enormous hands for her age, the way small children grab on to what steadies them. She whispered to him about frogs and fire trucks and unfinished drawings, small worlds to wedge between the terror and the truth. Michael heard her and tried to answer, but each breath was a ledger of pain. He kept his eyes on her. He kept his fingers curled around the pencil she had hidden in her pocket. At the hospital, they slid him under lights too bright to be comforting. Nurses moved like trained tides. A doctor's face leaned about him, lined and grave. Machines took over some of the work of keeping him alive. In a moment between anesthetic and memory, a nurse found a dog tag tucked inside his shirt, a small scratched piece of metal that read a name he barely used anymore: Sergeant Michael Hale. Ghost Wolf, a nickname that meant more in some rooms than in others. Colonel James Peterson came through the emergency room doors like a man who had listened for that name and heard it across 100 miles of distance and years. He looked at the dog tag, and his face folded into something that was almost prayer. He did not say the nickname aloud at first. Recognition was private, a check on the map of the past. He had been in special forces with Michael. Years of missions that were not stories for cocktail party ears. He had watched a young man choose a different kind of life when the war he had fought stopped being a chain that bound his days. Peterson stayed in the periphery with the family. He watched Ella as if she were the most guarded post. He watched Isabella from across the room, the lines around her mouth losing their professional hardness. He watched reporters gather like moths and musicians hang on the edges of the impossible. The footage from the ballroom spread like wildfire. A phone had captured the moment. Michael stumbling into the frame in a maintenance vest. Sophie frozen. The shot. The collapse. Dozens of outlets ran the clip. People watched as if they needed to know what courage looked like when it was not staged. The man who had been mocked by a few guests minutes before, someone whose work jacket had been a punchline at a table, became the only person anyone could see. That first night, the comment threads darkened and shone in turns. There were the immediate, ugly voices, mockery and petty cruelty from some who had judged him without a thought. And then there were thousands more who would not let that cruelty stand, who turned the mockery into shame and demanded answers. The board at Lane Corporation would learn in brutal clarity that the world now watched for moral tone, not just earnings. In the days that followed, the hospital became a place where private histories collided with public curiosity. Michael lay under sheets and slept with his daughter at his side. Machines kept a measured rhythm that the doctors read like a language. The surgeons had done their work. The damage was severe, and they had fought to patch each hole of it. Recovery would be long and uncertain. The conversation between medical staff was clinical, pragmatic, and careful with hope. Outside, the company prepared to respond. Isabella called a meeting, and the boardroom that had once been a battleground of quarterly gains shifted into a different kind of calculus: accountability and gesture. She had to decide how a leader at the top would answer when the world said she had failed to protect dignity in her halls. She had to decide how she would stand in front of her daughter and say that adults had mattered more about status than people. Isabella Lane was raised to take names and take names off lists. She learned to take responsibility in private, but she had never been taught how to accept her rawness in public. She arrived at the hospital the afternoon after the incident, with her hair pulled back and her face softened in a way those around her had rarely seen. Sophie, still trembling but steady, looped her fingers through Isabella's and traced the scar in the fabric of Michael's shirt, as if finding where safety had lived. Somewhere between the sterile corridor and the late-night news cycles, Richard Torres learned that lines he had once thought were invisible were not. He had been the operations manager who made a joke at the maintenance crew's expense. He was the man who had said what others had been too polite to say, and for a few hours that night, He wore his arrogance like armor. The footage cut to his face. It was not a flattering look. The company faced a public that demanded consequences for small cruelties that enabled a culture of looking down. Torres's position on the operations team moved from secure to precarious as the narrative of the night shifted into a moral ledger. But the most significant revelation was quieter and more intimate. The dog tag, the name, the story that had branded itself across social media timelines. Colonel Peterson, older and steadier than the cameras could render, walked into a makeshift room where 1,000 versions of the story had already spun themselves. He sat with Michael's daughter, spoke to Ella like a man who had once taught children badly, by example, not lectures. He told her the truth. Michael had been trained to protect. He had been trained to look forward and to leap without counting cost. He had chosen, when his wife had died, to step away from that life and become the kind of man who changed diapers and made oatmeal and attended school recitals. Fatherhood, he said, was a battlefield too, a daily, quieter kind of courage. Flashbacks came in small, warm bursts. Michael at a kitchen table teaching Ella to tie a shoelace. A wife's laugh, tucked like a photograph into a drawer. A road sign that told him to come home. He had once been a man who moved with the confidence of someone used to trusting a plan. He learned, slowly and painfully, that plans make you older faster than you expect. He had traded equipment for a toolbox, missions for school pickups, rank for the soft authority of bedtime stories. He had done it out of a love that looked like stubbornness and small sacrifices. Isabella's own backstory appeared in contrast. She had been raised in a house where silence was a ledger of success and failure. She had built Lane Corporation into something lean and powerful. She had learned to say no to distraction, to prioritize growth above kindness at times that later looked like blind spots. Her daughter had been protected from mess, but in the sheltering she had been isolated. Sophie had learned to navigate the world by observing and mirroring. When the shooting happened, Isabella's armor cracked because she understood, in the marrow, how fragile the scaffolding around her child had been. The public's reaction pushed the company into a fever of response. The clip of Michael collapsed with a child in his arms looped across channels. Commentators called him a hero. Veterans offered solemn praise. Strangers offered donations and letters stuffed with art from children who drew stick figures of 3 people holding hands. The online chorus demanded accountability for those who had mocked him. There were op-eds about dignity in the workplace and columns that asked whether we recognized the invisible work that made our lives possible. Isabella convened the board. The room smelled of expensive coffee and polished wood. Some directors were ready to spin the incident into a benevolent narrative, a gala where lessons were learned, a checkbook opened, a crisis managed. Others pushed for deeper change, policy over PR. The footage of the mocking laughter at Michael's expense was played in the room, and for the first time in her leadership, Isabella listened while her name did not appear at the center. She listened to what employees whispered in the hallways, to the veterans who called in and told their own stories, to the public that would not let a small cruelty fade. Richard Torres found himself at the center of a corporate storm. Conversations that had once been whispered in staff rooms became formal inquiries. Actions were taken, the kind that demanded both a symbol and a substance. He was relieved of duties in a manner that insisted on clarity. It was not showy vengeance. It was the company recalibrating itself under a new pressure. Isabella announced an internal review and, more importantly, a plan to create a foundation in Michael's name. A platform, she said, to support veterans transitioning to civilian life and single parents who bore invisible labor. The board would fund it. The public demanded it. The cameras circled. Colonel Peterson sat through the announcements with a hand over his mouth, the way a man keeps his grief from surfacing too fast. He called Michael Ghost Wolf again, this time not as a legend but as an account of the man who had chosen differently when his obligations shifted from mission to daughter. He argued for a different kind of recognition, one that honored service without turning it into spectacle. For Michael, the offer of a foundation and a place to help shape veteran programs came wrapped in ever so many nicknames, interviews, and invitations. Offers rolled in from networks and speakers bureaus. There was the smell of celebrity, of the public's appetite for heroes. Michael said no to most of it. He had been taught humility in the twinned crucibles of combat and fatherhood. He found it easier to accept a simple thing, permission to be a man with a family again, than a microphone and a stage. He wanted to be recognized, not feted. He wanted a chance to teach other veterans how to unlearn war and to love a grocery list. He wanted the kind of dignity that came wrapped in a job that allowed him to support Ella and to pay the bills without becoming a spectacle. His recovery was slow. Days eroded into a calendar marked by small victories, a laugh out of Ella that did not tremble, a step down a hallway without a cane, a voice that returned to ordinary frequencies. He spent weeks in therapy, physical and otherwise, until his shoulder bent the way it had before, until his breaths no longer tightened at the memory of the night. The dog tag had been cleaned and returned. Colonel Peterson visited often and told him stories that were both dangerous and comforting, of nights in foreign places and of the smallest acts of kindness in the worst moments. Peterson said one evening, "You always picked the child," meaning more than he could say. "You always put the other life ahead of your own." Isabella visited too. She brought Sophie and places for tea that Michael's daughter liked. She came with apologies that took the shape of plans. She spoke to Michael in corridors and in waiting rooms, asking how the company could do better, how they could lift up the invisible. She said the word sorry and then built a foundation in public and private. She told the board she had been blind about certain things and that the company would be better for the blindness being exposed. For her, the crisis moved her into a type of introspection that would change policy. She would not let this moment become just a PR play. The foundation, the Lane Michael Initiative, in a name that the press would circle like vultures and saints in equivalent measure, aimed to fund transitional housing, job training for veterans, and childcare support for single parents. It would be a bridge, Isabella said, between the life of privilege and the unseen labor that supported it. She stood in front of microphones and offered a framework, but she also showed up in quiet, in hospital rooms and in neighborhood centers, to listen. She learned that restitution was not merely a headline, but a slow, bureaucratic craft. The town offered small tributes. Children in schools colored pictures of a man with a cape. A local veterans group hosted a potluck where Michael sat at the head of a table and ate only pie because he was nervous. Neighbors brought casseroles and practicalities, gift cards, envelopes stamped with small kindnesses. The public sent letters. Journalists wanted quotes about heroism. Michael answered with a flatness that hid the flood. He insisted his act had not been about bravery as a badge, but about instinct and responsibility. Sophie and Ella, who had met that night in fear, began to meet in playing. Sophie was quieter now, learning that the world could be both cruel and soft. Ella insisted on teaching her the secret handshake she called Superdad mode. They made friendship in small rounds. Dress swapping, whispered jokes about who could jump higher, joint conspiracies to draw on the back of old cardboard boxes. They would later sit together at a foundation launch and make a poster that said "Friends" in lopsided letters and colors that bled into each other. Public opinion shifted toward an appreciation of the invisible. Stories about maintenance workers, janitors, security staff, and single parents began to appear in long-form pieces. People realized they had grown comfortable with an economy that valued charm above care. They had to learn a different vocabulary. The story became a mirror for what communities could do when pressed. The moral ledger balanced toward repair, in some rooms, quietly and imperfectly. There were nights when Michael woke and the scar across his chest tightened like a memory that had not yet become a story. He feared applause and interviews the way others feared storms. He wanted, more than anything, a life in which his daughter did not have to inherit the terror he had felt. He wanted to teach her to make pancakes without always looking over their shoulders. He wanted to watch both girls learn to braid each other's hair and to understand that courage takes many forms: staying, caring, being present. In the quieter days, he met with other veterans at a community center that smelled of coffee and linoleum. Men and women gathered around fold-out tables and spoke in a cadence that was partly confession and partly instruction. They compared scars and recipes and told stories that were both funny and raw in the way only those who had seen everything could be. Michael listened more than he spoke. He would sometimes answer a question with a kind of flat humor and then, unexpectedly, offer the kind of advice he had once given on a far-off base. "Find one thing to be ordinary about," he'd say. "It steadies you." Isabella attended a session once, not as a leader, but as a witness. She sat in the back and listened to men talk about reintegration and about how the world assumed victory meant the end of struggle. She learned to see the edges of her decisions. Budget cuts that had once made sense in quarterly reports turned out to have human consequences. She came away with a resolve that changed her tone at board meetings. She started to insist that budgets account for human lives and that HR had a louder voice. The change was not complete, but it was something more than a speech. Months later, the Lane Michael Initiative held its first community event in a park on a sunny day. There were long tables, a band of volunteers, a barbecue. Children ran between picnic blankets like small comets. A ribbon was cut, a symbolic act, and the press took pictures. Isabella and Michael stood side by side. They were photographed laughing as if they had always been friends. Richard Torres did not attend. He had left the company quietly and took his own complex path, learning the hard and necessary thing that humiliation sometimes teaches: how to look at a mirror. Michael spoke that day in a way that surprised everyone who had expected a hero speech. He talked about work and dignity, about embracing the invisible people who hold up polished lives. He thanked people, but he did not ask for applause. He placed his emphasis on what other people could do: hold the door, pay a fair wage, watch a child when no one else would. His voice was steady. Ella stood next to him, a stubby banner in her hand that said "Dad" in crayon. Sophie came and stood with a shy smile. The girls took turns tucking their fingers into his and looked up at him as if he were a cliff they knew they could climb. In the months that followed, Michael refused most offers. He turned down a show, he declined a speaker's tour. He accepted a quieter role, helping the foundation design programs that actually served families like his. He taught classes on practical maintenance skills to veterans who needed work that fit into home schedules. He met, sometimes in the evenings, with young fathers who needed advice not about heroics, but about diaper creams and bank account statements. He wanted substance. He wanted to be useful, not famous. The media occasionally tried to paint him as an emblem. He let them. He used the attention to draw resources to the foundation and to raise awareness about transitions from service to civilian life. He declined cameras in hospital wings and allowed the focus to be on the work being done. In interviews he would say, simply and without theatricality, that he didn't feel like a hero. He told the press that he had done what he had to do in a split second and that any parent would do the same if faced with the same choice. "It was a thing," he told a reporter once. "I did what was needed. I have a daughter." Isabella, for her part, learned that apology is a practice, not a slogan. She visited local schools and asked them how the foundation could help with after-school programs. She sat with mothers in community rooms and listened to them list the small gaps that made life wobbly: reliable childcare, flexible hours, a place to dry out spilled milk. She instituted policies inside the company that recognized the workloads of lesser-paid staff and took steps to create a more humane place. There were setbacks.
The foundation's first year saw funding challenges, administrative snafus, and moments where press cycles forgot the human faces behind the work. There were arguments at town halls about mission drift and the practicalities of good management. Michael found these details both exhausting and necessary. He learned to love the spreadsheets in a way he never expected. He learned how to argue for efficiency without losing the warmth that had animated his reasons for doing the work. Ella grew. She learned to be proud of her father without letting it shape the core of who she was. She became bolder in school, making friends, learning to write her name with less shakiness. Sophie and Ella created a list of secret missions to protect each other that involved small acts. Showing up at noon for a playdate, shelving library books, bringing a flower to school when someone looked sad. The promise they made to each other was less about the dramatic and more about the practical, staying. As time folded, the scar on Michael's chest faded into a line that sometimes caught sunlight and made him wince when he bent the wrong way. It was, for him, a reminder rather than an exclamation. He had caught a child's life.
He had saved an afternoon. He had not, he kept insisting, saved anything but an immediate future. The work of rebuilding lives remained broader than one night's headline. He and Isabella developed an uneasy, profound respect that was not friendship at first, but a working partnership. They argued over budgets and program priorities. They celebrated quietly when a training module placed a veteran in steady work, when a single mother called and said her child had not been late to school in a month. They showed up at events together and learned to place their hands on a ribbon with a practiced, respectful distance. There were nights when he still dreamed the way men who had been conditioned to expect danger do, with improbable noise and impossible escapes. The nightmares thinned with the help of therapy and a schedule. He came to understand that bravery had a price and that acceptance of help was not weakness. For a man taught to shoulder burdens alone, asking for a hand felt at times like a foreign country. But he learned to accept it, and in that acceptance he found a new kind of strength. The town began to notice the change in tone. People who had once tossed off a joke at a maintenance worker's expense felt uncomfortable when confronted with the deeper story. Some made amends publicly, others privately. Some did not change at all, and those edges of human hardness remained. But the narrative had shifted enough to create a new standard. The invisible would no longer be as invisible. On the second anniversary of the night, the Lane Michael Initiative held a small ceremony. Michael, now steadier on his feet, spoke about ordinary protections. He read letters from children who had learned to thank someone whose work had once been background. He watched Sophie and Ella swap jokes and roll their eyes like sisters. Isabella stood to the side and listened, her face soft with something like relief. After the event, as the sun dipped low and shadows lengthened, Michael walked with Ella and Sophie to a little playground beyond the picnic lawn. The air smelled of cut grass and late summer. He pushed them on swings and watched them climb, each movement an ordinary miracle. He thought about the moment in the ballroom and how everything pivoted from a breath and a choice. He thought about the man he had been before he left the military and the man he had chosen to be after. He had not sought admiration. He had sought a life that made sense for the small people who needed him. He held the hands of two girls and found his anchor. He had been a soldier. Now he was a father, who still carried the habits his training had built but had repurposed them. Duty had not fallen away. It had found a new address. He would wake at dawn and fix faucets and teach tool safety to young men who had known more danger than peace. He would show up in meetings and argue for a better life for the invisible. He would say no to cameras more often than he said yes. At night, when Ella slept and the house breathed in quiet, Michael would look at the dog tag on his dresser. It was weathered and small. He turned it over in his fingers like a relic. The nickname Ghost Wolf felt both ancient and absurd for a man who had traded stealth for storybooks. He traced the nicked letters with a thumb and felt the thin, steady thrum of being alive. The world had made him an emblem. He had refused to let the emblem swallow the man. He accepted recognition, but not adulation. He wanted the work to be what was remembered, not the moment itself. The foundation he had helped shape would run programs long after cameras had left. He wanted quiet continuity more than applause. In the end, the public did what it sometimes does when a story is honest. It made room for repair. The shame of the mocking table did not erase every small cruelty in the company, but it taught a lesson. Isabella enacted policy changes, and the company committed to regular audits of employee treatment. They published annual reports on the foundation's impact. They opened a small childcare center for employees with low wages. None of it was perfect, but it was movement, and movement matters. Years later, a journalist would ask Michael whether the night had changed him. He sat at a kitchen table with Ella, now older, and Sophie came for visits with a dog-eared comic book in hand. He stirred his coffee and thought about the word courage in headlines. He answered simply, "It taught me that courage isn't about one big thing. It's about mornings you show up. It's about keeping a child safe. It's about learning to ask for help when you need it." Sophie and Ella ran outside to a small tree they had planted in the park when the foundation had its first real funded project. It was a sapling then. Now it shaded a little patch of grass. Michael watched them climb the low limbs like small animals, and something in him settled. He had been a soldier and a maintenance worker and a reluctant emblem. Now he was mostly a father who could breathe because his child could sleep at night. The story would always be told with the same raw kernel. A single dad saves a CEO's daughter from a deadly threat. The phrase, "incredible act of courage, single dad saves CEO's daughter from deadly threat," would appear in headlines and footnotes in the memory of those who had been there and those who had watched. But the truth that lived inside the story was messy and daily. A man who chose a new life, a daughter whose handshake read like a promise, a CEO who learned to listen, and a community that built scaffolding where it had once been absent. On a quiet evening, Michael stood by the playground and watched both girls chase each other. He folded his arms and let the dusk settle on his shoulders. He thought of the dog tag in his pocket and of Colonel Peterson's steady hands. He thought of Isabella's apology and the small policy meetings that had taken so much effort.
He thought of forgiveness and the slow math of restitution. He had taken a bullet for a child he did not know. He had done what any parent might do. But he also, in that action, remade a narrative that helped a company see the value of the people who made its lights stay on. He refused to let his life become a billboard. Instead, he used the attention to build something that could help others stand when they had been knocked down. He leaned against the chain-link fence and let the faint noise of the city dissolve into the sound of children playing, a sound that had become the daily hymn of his life. The world, for all its cruelty, still offered small mercies. A childhood drawing pinned on a fridge, a quiet handshake, a foundation that put work into practice. "You kept her safe," Ella said later that night as she tucked a blanket over him in their small apartment, too old now to be tucked herself. Michael smiled. "We kept each other safe," he said. And he meant it the way only a father can, with the weight of ordinary hours wrapped around the words. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that courage often lives in the people we pass every day. Consider supporting veteran and single-parent resources linked below so their work can continue beyond headlines.